So the VP debate was almost 2 weeks ago, but I really did want to comment on a few things that JD Vance said that were, just a little out of touch.
These guys do is they make a lot of claims about if Donald Trump becomes president, all of these terrible consequences are going to ensue. But in reality,
Donald Trump was president. Inflation was low. Take-home pay was higher. And he saved the very program from a Democratic administration that was collapsing.
American First Amendment principle that we ought to debate our differences. We ought to argue about them. We ought to try to persuade our fellow Americans. Kamala Harris is engaged in censorship at an industrial scale. She did it during COVID. She's done it over a number of other issues. And that, to me, is a much bigger threat to democracy than what Donald Trump said when he said that protesters should peacefully protest on January the 6th.
Nothing to say about the people who were injured and killed as a result of the conduct of his running mate, but okay, I just wanted to enlighten the senator. There are many reasons why Trump might be referred to as a threat to democracy, but I will limit myself to nominating just a few. I guess earlier on in the debate, the moderators mentioned that
after the 2020 election, President Trump's campaign and others filed 62 lawsuits contesting the results. Judges, including those appointed by President Trump and other Republican presidents, looked at the evidence and said there was no widespread fraud.
So you might think that the claims of election fraud would be put to rest by now, but no, Donald Trump continues to say that he won the 2020 election and that the election was rigged and stolen. And it was these claims that contributed to the incitement of the January 6th attacks on the Capitol, along with the conviction that we're not going to have a country anymore, whatever that means. Good thing he stopped inflaming his supporters by saying that. And to be very clear, our country is fine. The US has the highest GDP and GDP per capita in the world. The stock market recently hit a record high. Wages are outpacing inflation, which has been in the 2% range and totally in line with other G7 advanced economy countries. Border crossings have been down lately since Biden issued executive orders on the matter in June. See more on that in my previous post on TikTok. I might make a YouTube video about it too. Now, the contention is always this plausible deniability. He used the adverb peacefully on January 6th, but that doesn't really convince me. I still don't think that Donald Trump was born yesterday. I think that he understands the effect that he has on his followers who laugh and applaud at the explicitly violent suggestions that he makes.
You have hundreds and hundreds of people, and you have 2 or 3 border security people that are brave and great. And don't forget, we don't let them, and we can't let them use weapons. We can't. Other countries do. We can't. I would never do that. But how do you stop these people? You can't. There's no... That's only in the panhandle you can get away with that statement. Now, if you had one really violent day, like a guy like Mike Kelly, put him in charge, Congressman Kelly, put him in charge for one day. Mike, would you say, he's right here, he's a great congressman. Would you say, Mike, that if you were in charge, you would say, oh, please, don't touch them, don't touch them, let them rob your store. Let all these stores go out of business, right? They don't pay rent, the city doesn't have, it's a chain of events that's so bad. One rough hour, and I mean real rough, the word will get out, and it will end immediately. End immediately.
Also, prior to January 6th, Donald Trump was going to replace Jeffrey Rosen with Jeffrey Clark as acting attorney general with the intent of leveraging the power of the Department of Justice to overturn the election. That is according to the testimony of not the Biden-Harris regime, but of people with whom Donald Trump chose to work closely. The testimony was that a group of DOJ officials had to threaten to resign en masse to prevent that from happening. And the rebuttal to all of this is that Donald Trump's former staff are traitors and they are all lying, even though they all sort of have the same story. And Donald Trump is telling the truth as we can trust him to do, and as he always does. Mike Pence also prevented the election from being overturned despite Donald Trump publicly pressuring him to refuse to certify the results. Project 2025 also displayed some hostility toward democracy. Donald Trump disavowed the mandate for leadership, but I still think that the document is worthy of talking about in this video. But also, really? You don't know the most prominent conservative think tank in the country whose President's Club meeting you delivered remarks at?
It's an incredible honor to be here tonight to celebrate this really wonderful foundation.
Also, the majority of people who were quote-unquote behind Project 2025 worked under the Trump administration. And of course, Donald Trump is very careful not to actually specify any of the policies from Project 2025 that he disagreed with. He has to keep everything very open to interpretation so that people can twist themselves into pretzels trying to provide explanations for the indefensible. The Heritage Foundation makes a mandate for leadership each election cycle that details the sorts of policies that the conservative think tank would like to see from the president, and oh boy was this iteration extreme. One of the most alarming parts of Project 2025 involved reinstating Donald Trump's Executive Order 13951, which was issued a month before the 2020 presidential election. This involves reclassifying Schedule F employees, that is, hundreds of thousands of career civil servants who populate the government and the Department of Justice, the Federal Bureau of Investigation, the Federal Communications Commission, and so on. Think of what a lawless president could do if the DOJ is staffed with Trump's own people who are loyal to Trump and not the law. Donald Trump pressed people to refuse to certify the election results, but the election results did end up getting certified in no small part because Executive Order 13951 had not been implemented yet, and those Schedule F employees had not yet been reclassified. That executive order was an attempt to concentrate power in the executive branch and an effective immunization from checks and balances, which would have made the president at liberty to do such things as overturn elections and assassinate political rivals. Actually, if it's an official act, whatever that is, then the president can already do those sorts of things because they will be protected from criminal prosecution. This is a provision from the bonkers Trump versus United States ruling decided by the Supreme Court, a third of which was appointed by Donald Trump, and Donald Trump's appointees constituted half of that majority decision. By the way, this Schedule F thing and the concentration of power in the executive branch is pretty adjacent to what Viktor Orban did as Prime Minister of Hungary. He dismantled the pillars of democracy in his country to implement what he probably calls an illiberal democracy, whatever the heck that's supposed to mean. Also, if the name Viktor Orban sounds familiar to you, then you may remember him as one of the speakers from the Conservative Political Action Committee.
If somebody has doubts whether progressive liberals and communists are the same, just ask us Hungarians. We fought them both, and I can tell you they are the same.
Or you may have heard of Donald Trump admiring Viktor Orban's, strength.
You know, I was very honored as a man. Viktor Orban. Did anyone ever hear of him? He's probably like one of the strongest leaders anywhere in the world, and he's the leader of, right? He's the leader of Turkey. Fronts on both.
A person who completely changes a country's form of government can be construed as powerful, but there's probably a point at which admiration for that leader crosses a line into disregard for proper leadership and human rights, and is actually just displaying an infatuation of overbearing, dominating power.
A great chemistry. But people ask me, how smart is she? I said, top of the line. You never met anybody smarter. How smart is Kim Jong-un? Top of the line. You know, people say, oh, this and that. Really smart. You know, when you come out and as a young man at 24, 23, even though he sort of inherits it, most people, when they inherit, they lose it. And that's easy stuff. He took over a country of very smart people, very, very energetic people, very tough people, at a very young age, and he has total dominant control. That's not easy. These are very smart. Putin, very smart. Now he's had...
Donald Trump has also just said and posted stupid rubbish, like at this Christian summit thing, he literally said that people won't have to vote after electing him.
Get your friends, get your family, get everyone you know, and vote. Vote early, Vote absentee, vote on election day. I don't care how, but you have to get out and vote. And again, Christians, get out and vote just this time. You won't have to do it anymore. 4 more years, you know what? It'll be fixed. It'll be fine. You won't have to vote anymore, my beautiful Christians. I love you, Christians. I'm a Christian. I love you. Get out. You got to get out and vote. In 4 years, you don't have to vote again. We'll have it fixed so good you're not going to have to vote. In conclusion,
I also think that there is something to be said about information systems as they relate to democracy. Walter Cronkite said, "Freedom of the press is not just important to democracy, it is democracy." That is to say that people acquire their understandings of how their cities and countries work by consuming news sources. And so if people don't have access to accurate information, then they will not be equipped to collectively govern their country. The republic/democracy will not actually be in the control of the people. So there are actual consequences to Donald Trump's reference to the press as the fake news that he makes at every single one of his rallies, when he floods information systems with sewage and says that people who are telling the truth are lying. He is really effectively hindering the ability of people to understand and participate in the work that their institutions are doing. Now, according to J.D. Vance, Kamala Harris poses a much bigger threat to democracy because the Biden administration censored some anti-vax posts on Facebook.
Lose the election. I would just ask that. Did he lose the 2020 election?
Tim, I'm focused on the future. Did Kamala Harris censor Americans from speaking their mind in the wake of the 2020 COVID situation? Okay.
Did Donald Trump lose the 2020 election?
Let me ask you a question. Is it okay that big technology companies censored the Hunter Biden laptop?
Did Donald Trump lose? That's the question, and you know that's the question.
Martha, I've said repeatedly, I think the 2020 election had problems. You want to say rigged? You want to say he won? Use whatever vocabulary term you want. I want to focus on the fact that we had big technology firms censoring our fellow.
Can we also talk about how weird it was of J.D. Vance, the vice presidential nominee, to display such a profound misunderstanding of what the vice president is supposed to do?
The entire driver of higher housing prices, it's also the regulatory regime of Kamala Harris. Look,
Yeah, so the vice president's role is not to dictate policy. It's more so to oversee the Senate and cast the tie-breaking vote in the events that the Senate votes for and against bills are equal. The vice president may also sometimes advise the president, and of course they are there to stand in for if anything happens to the president that takes them out of their position.
Kamala Harris is not running as a newcomer to politics. She is the sitting vice president. If she wants to enact all of these policies to make housing more affordable, I invite her to use the office that the American people already gave her, not sit around and campaign and do nothing while Americans...
Well, J.D. Vance is part of the campaign in which the absurd and appalling are inextricable from the unsurprising. I can't wrap my head around him, but it's business as usual, and I don't think that J.D. Vance misunderstands the fact that the vice president doesn't dictate policy. I think that he's just pretending that the policies came from Kamala Harris because she is the newest in a series of qualified people who are standing in his way of getting into office, and he is trying to smear her name. And that strategy works because the people who support him and Donald Trump don't understand how the government works and how it ought to work anyway. But I digress. I wanted to respond to this argument that Kamala Harris is a bigger threat to democracy than Donald Trump for the reason that she imposed censorship on an industrial level, because censoring vaccine misinformation infringes on the freedom of speech, and we ought to just have a debate about it. As though the CDC doesn't make the research and deliberations that they employ for their vaccination schedules publicly available. So, the freedom of speech does not protect outright dangerous lies and misinformation that puts people in danger. Vaccines are one of the greatest public health developments in human history, and decisions made by the Biden-Harris administration to censor efforts to undermine the efficacy of vaccines is totally in line with such historical decisions as Schenck versus United States and Feiner versus New York. Now, I want to be very clear that mistrust in institutions is not inherently bad, but we want to make sure that the mistrust is informed and warranted. So I wanted to include a few tips on accessing accurate information that I hope viewers will employ. A number of sources recommend that we sift that is, stop. The information that we receive from the news and press has evolved to be inflammatory and partisan. Information sources have an incentive to create narratives that condition their audiences to see a binary right and wrong on political issues because that will fuel engagement and loyalty. Now, as typical normie American citizens, it is our obligation to remember that consuming and sharing accurate information is not going to be in our capability if we do not employ a level head, if we do not employ awareness about what sorts of feelings are coming up for us as we consume a given piece of content. Investigate the source. Consider the people who are behind the distribution of the information that you are consuming and make yourself aware of their credibility. Fox News paid a $787 million settlement on account of lies that they spread pertaining to the 2020 presidential election. Just saying. Find other coverage. A lot of people get this idea in their head that they know of a source that is trustworthy and that will tell the truth. I guess there is some appeal to this line of thinking because developing our own perspectives on consequential issues is hard, and just mirroring the talking points and perspectives of Ben Shapiro or something is much less effortful and scary. But recognize the delusion in this. No single source is going to cover every single issue and story perfectly. In fact, employing diversity in the news sources that you consume is going to be the absolute best way that you can think with autonomy, develop a balanced perspective for yourself, and be in touch with what is happening and the commentary surrounding it. Trace information back to the original source. See if you can substantiate all of the terrifying things that the talking heads and politicians and influencers are reporting. I mentioned that news stories have a tendency to be inflammatory, and the original source might have a very different tone and narrative than what the talking heads conveyed. I hope that some of this may have been convincing or empowering, and that a viewer feels more like an agent in accessing information. I started this video with some talk about why it is not advisable to vote for Donald Trump, and a lot of people understand the hot mess at the top of their ballot, but they still choose to not vote for Kamala Harris. A lot of undecided voters employ this kind of thinking, like the case against Donald Trump is strong, but the case for Kamala Harris isn't. And these people seem to fail to understand a couple of things. Most obviously, they misunderstand that it's also a vote against Donald Trump to vote for Kamala Harris, but also it is too much to expect from the President of the United States to be as good as Donald Trump is bad. This is a false equivalence fallacy. Also, I do think that the case for Kamala Harris is strong. I try to post a balanced amount on TikTok about both of these things, partly because the subject of Donald Trump is an unpleasant one, but I also understand why Kamala Harris's competent plans for the economy and Medicare and so on will be obscure in comparison to the nature of this walking, crotchety, horribly aging tabloid article. I think that the case for Kamala Harris is strong, even though I don't agree with every single thing that she has said and done. But voting for politicians is not an Uber. It will not arrive you to exactly where you want to go. Voting is a bus. You are trying to get as close as you can to your destination. So keep this in mind as you vote and participate in democracy. If you are not registered to vote in this election, you might still be able to. Go to iwillvote.com or voterizer.org to register, check your registration status, request an absentee ballot, and more.